Hello, everyone. It's Eric from Strong Medicine. Regular viewers may remember that a few months ago, I was working on what was to be an epic hour-long video to discuss whether or not Trump and Biden had dementia. But as I was midway through, I more or less gave up because I realized that the question was actually kind of silly. It didn't matter if they had dementia. What mattered was whether or not either was cognitively fit enough to be president, and the answer then was no, they were not. But now, as everyone knows, Biden has sensibly bowed out from his re-election campaign, while Trump remains all in. Now, I still don't think the question of whether or not Trump specifically has dementia as the cause of his cognitive problems is any more relevant now than it was in July. But after some of his bizarre statements in the past few weeks, there are plenty of people who are very reasonably and understandably wondering about that. And yesterday's presidential debate, it was not reassuring. So, in short, I'm going to revisit the question today of what is going on in Trump's head. But I'll be specifically focusing on Trump's use of language as for looking for examples of some interesting neuropsychiatric findings. And hopefully, you'll learn a little medicine along the way. Before I get into the specifics, I need to point out challenges that come with assessing Trump's use of language. First, and let's be honest, he's never been a particularly articulate individual. Not on The Apprentice, nor during countless media appearances dating back to the 80s. He has always spoken confidently, but confidence is not eloquence. And I know that there are claims to the contrary about Trump's ability to speak eloquently in his younger years, and maybe he spoke more clearly than the average person on the street then. But remember, he's a child of a wealthy New York businessman and a graduate of Penn. Trump would have sounded like the class idiot in those circles. So his baseline that we are using to better understand his current speech, it's already going to start off lower than it would for most other national politicians. Second, there have been serious and legitimate questions raised in the past as to whether Trump has something called functional illiteracy. Functional illiteracy does not mean the person literally can't read, because obviously Trump can, but rather it means that a person has difficulty comprehending and using written language to the level necessary for routine tasks of daily living and employment. For example, in Trump's case, all of his books have been ghostwritten. All right, maybe he just doesn't have time to write, but that's sort of, not great that the man has all this stuff ghostwritten. While he was president, he preferred for his White House daily briefings to be delivered orally rather than in written form. And his tweets, or truths, so to speak, they're written at an elementary school reading level. Trump is also known for having an extreme aversion to reading. It's not clear if he's read an entire book during his adult life. Not one book. I would not be surprised to learn that he has not even read his own ghostwritten book, Art of the Deal. Now, while it is extremely concerning for a president to be potentially functionally illiterate, that would be the consequence of poor education or learning disability, and not from a primary neurologic or psychiatric illness. The bottom line, though, why this is relevant today, is that we need to consider these things when assessing his use of language because it's all related. How he uses verbal language is going to be related to how well he can use the written language. With those considerations spoken, let's start with the most straightforward language-related findings. When speaking, Trump makes a lot of paraphasic errors. Paraphasic errors are deficits in the fluency of spoken language on the scale of single words. So there's a lot of subtypes to paraphasia. They include verbal paraphasia, in which one real word is incorrectly substituted for another real word. These can be semantic paraphasic errors, in which the incorrect word is contextually similar to the correct one. For example, referring to a donut as a cupcake, or referring to a car as a van. Another form of verbal paraphasia is sometimes called remote or unrelated paraphasia, in which the incorrect word has nothing to do with the correct one. For example, instead of saying, "I left my keys in the house," one might say, "I left my keys in the avocado." Moving on from verbal paraphasia, there is phonemic paraphasia, in which there is a substitution of a non-word for a word with which it shares some syllables, like saying ricicle instead of bicycle, or groccoli instead of broccoli. And in neologistic paraphasia, there is the use of non-words that do not sound similar to the intended word. It's a brief moment of gibberish that's sandwiched between otherwise normal speech. All forms of paraphasia are most classically described as a consequence of strokes, but they can be seen in plenty of other conditions, even sometimes from extreme sleep deprivation. Here's some classic Trump paraphasic errors that you may have seen on the media or online somewhere.
They work 2 jobs and sometimes 3 jobs. They sacrifice every day for the furniture and future of their children. You got to start doing it over here, and you really have. I mean, you've really put a big investment in our country. We appreciate it very much, Tim Apple. But we're opening it up. We have to... Just this week, it was reported that an illegal alien, and you just look at this, what's happening. Boeing had a little hard time, as you heard. So they're going to save, Leon's going to send up a rocket. He looks forward to it. That's all he thinks about is things like that.
Moving on, something that has been reported in the last several months is that Trump's ability to use spoken language has declined over the last few years. But as I previously suggested, it was never really great to begin with. In one formal analysis of the first 30,000 words spoken in office by each of the last 15 presidents, Trump was an extreme outlier, speaking at a 4th grade reading level. And this was based on his speaking in 2017. That's 7 years ago. Also from 2017 was this interesting interview by Brian Williams, of a linguistics professor, about Trump's use of language.
Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
I've been wanting to ask you, what is your linguistics definition of this president?
Donald Trump linguistically is unadorned. This is the basics. This is what language was undoubtedly like when it first emerged among people who didn't have writing and were first getting their verbal sea legs. This is where it started. And so in that way, as in so many others, Donald Trump is an original.
That would mean that education and schooling has had no effect on his use of language. He's quick to remind us that he went to the best schools.
And he learned nothing in them. He speaks like someone who paid no attention to one of the goals of education, which is to refine our natural inborn proclivities of speech, which are great for casual circumstances. But he uses those same ways of speaking in what most of us used to consider formal and important circumstances.
In other words, Trump speaks like a person who has never learned to express themselves in writing, similar to being functionally illiterate. Thus, he always speaks in an informal conversational voice, even in situations in which a formal voice would be expected and more appropriate, like during press conferences and interviews. When you watch and listen to him, this fits really well. But again, this is not necessarily a sign of dementia. Always speaking like you're illiterate feels more suggestive of a learning disability. However, I think these issues with Trump's speech that I've discussed so far are relatively minor compared to what we indirectly learn from his speech, and that is Trump's thought process. When used in a medical context, the term thought process is the largely unconscious way in which an individual organizes their thoughts. This is distinct from thought content. What Trump thinks is largely outside the scope of this video, but rather it's how he thinks and how he expresses his thoughts. That's what's relevant here. Imagine an interviewer asking a person a question, and in that person's brain, there is an answer somewhere. What that answer is, again, not relevant for now. We just care about the fact that there is an answer. When a person has a linear thought process, they can move directly and in a logical way from the question to the answer. For example, you ask a patient in the emergency room, "What brought you in here today?" And the patient responds something like, "I was feeling fine until about an hour ago. I was mowing the lawn when I suddenly got really short of breath." A direct question leads to a direct answer. When a person has a circumstantial thought process, their response to a question will be in the realm of the answer, and they will eventually get there, but they'll first talk about a few things that are only peripherally relevant. So instead of saying, I was mowing the lawn, I got short of breath, they'll respond something more like, I was mowing the lawn with this brand new Toro self-propelled electric mower that I got at Home Depot last month. It's the bomb. It's awesome. It's been working really well. And in fact, it's been working so well that my neighbor, he keeps asking to borrow it. I even thought of loaning it to him today, which I probably should have done because in retrospect, if I had done that, I wouldn't have had the lawnmower and then I would not have gotten short of breath and ended up here in the ER. Now, there's a lot of irrelevant or minimally relevant detail, but the person who responds that way does eventually get to the answer. I think circumstantial thought can, in some cases, be considered a normal variant, one that can be both frustrating and endearing at the same time. Here's an amusing example that you may have seen before.
Breathe, focus, keep it simple.
No doubt. Okay, so I'm at this art museum with my cousin Ignacio, right? And there was this like abstract expressionism exhibit. But you know me, I'm more like a neo-cubist kind of guy, right? But there was this one Rothko that was sublime, bro. Oh my God.
Luis.
Okay, sorry. I just get excited and stuff. But anyway, and Ignacio tells me, yo, I met this crazy fine writer chick at the spot last night. Like, fine, like crazy stupid fine. And he goes up to the bartender and goes, look at the girl I'm with. You know what I'm saying? She's crazy stupid fine, right? And the bartender's all like, yeah, crazy stupid fine. So this writer chick tells Ignacio, yo, I'm like a boss in the world of guerrilla journalism, and I got mad connects with the peeps behind the curtains, you know what I'm saying? Ignacio's like, for real? And she's like, yeah. You know what? I can't tell you who my contact is because he works with the Avengers. Oh, no. Yeah, and this dude sounds like a badass, man. Like, he comes up to her and says, yo, I'm looking for this dude who's new on the scene, who's, like, flashing this fresh tack, who's got, like, bomb moves, right? Who you got? She's like, well, we got everything nowadays. We got a guy who jumps. We got a guy who swings. We got a guy who crawls up the walls. You gotta be more specific. And he's like, I'm looking for a guy that shrinks.
So that's Louise from Ant-Man, the Ant-Man franchise. Classic circumstantial thought. Next is tangential thought, which starts off similarly to circumstantial thought, where it feels like it's sort of moving towards the answer, but in this case, it never actually gets there. Moving further away from linear thought is loosening of associations, in which the person moves from one irrelevant idea to another, but does so in a way that feels sort of relatively smooth. When I think of loosening of associations, I imagine that if I was only partially listening to the person without really paying close attention, I might not realize they were not making sense. And of course, the person with loosening of associations never actually answers the initial question posed to them. It never remotely comes back around to what was the initial topic of conversation. Then there is something called flight of ideas, in which the person chaotically jumps all over the place from one idea to the next without any clear connection or segue. This is often accompanied by unusually rapid speech and psychomotor agitation. Sometimes you see this with people with bipolar disease who are having a manic episode. And last, the most extreme abnormality of thought process is called word salad, in which random words and phrases are uttered with no underlying identifiable ideas, most classically associated with disorganized schizophrenia. To be clear, this diagram is an oversimplification of a complicated and rich topic. People do not progress through stages of thought disorders like this might suggest. Different forms can coexist in the same person at different times, and there are more unique thought disorder phenomena which I haven't included. But I still think this figure provides a rough idea of what these terms are referring to. So with these terminologies in mind, and this figure in mind, I want you to listen to 2 Trump clips and try to determine what thought process he's demonstrating in them. The first clip is not in direct response to a question, but the same general principles still apply.
Having nuclear, my uncle was a great professor and scientist and engineer, Dr. John Trump at MIT. Good genes, very good genes, okay? Very smart. The Wharton School of Finance, very good, very smart. You know, if you're a conservative Republican, if I were a liberal, if I ran as a liberal Democrat, they would say I'm one of the smartest people anywhere in the world. It's true. But when you're a conservative Republican, they try, do they do a number? That's why I always started, went to Wharton, was a good student, went there, did this, built the, I have to give my credentials all the time because we're at a little disadvantage. But you look at the nuclear deal, the thing that really bothers me, It would have been so easy. And it's not as important as these lives are. Nuclear is so powerful. My uncle explained that to me many, many years ago, the power. And that was 35 years ago. He would explain the power of what's going to happen. And he was right. Who would have thought? But when you look at what's going on with the 4 prisoners, now it used to be 3. Now it's 4. But when it was 3, and even now, I would have said it's all in the messenger. Fellas, and it is fellas because, they haven't figured that the women are smarter right now than the men, so, it's going to take them about another 150 years. But the Persians are great negotiators. The Iranians are great negotiators. So, and they just killed us.
One thing that Democrats and Republicans have in common is that both parties talk a lot about what they're going to do to address the childcare crisis, but neither party has delivered meaningful change. If you win in November, can you commit to prioritizing legislation to make childcare affordable? And if so, what specific piece of legislation will you advance?
Well, I would do that, and we're sitting down. I was somebody, we had Senator Marco Rubio, and my daughter Ivanka was so impactful on that issue. It's a very important issue, but I think when you talk about the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, that, because look, child care is child care. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it. But when you talk about those numbers compared to the kind of numbers that I'm talking about by taxing foreign nations at levels that they're not used to, but they'll get used to it very quickly. And it's not going to stop them from doing business with us, but they'll have a very substantial tax when they send product into our country. Those numbers are so much bigger than any numbers that we're talking about, including child care, that it's going to take care. We're going to have, I look forward to having no deficits within a fairly short period of time, coupled with the reductions that I told you about on waste and fraud and all of the other things that are going on in our country, because I have to stay with child care. I want to stay with child care, but those numbers are small relative to the kind of economic numbers that I'm talking about, including growth, but growth also headed up by what the plan is that I just told you about. We're going to be taking in trillions of dollars, and as much as child care is talked about as being expensive, it's relatively speaking not very expensive compared to the kind of numbers we'll be taking in. We're going to make this into an incredible country that can afford to take care of its people, and then we'll worry about the rest of the world. Let's help other people. But we're going to take care of our country first. This is about America first. It's about make America great again. We have to do it because right now we're a failing nation. So we'll take care of it. Thank you. Very good question. Thank you.
All right, so what do you think? In my opinion, these are both examples of loosening of associations. If Trump's just speaking in the background and you're not paying attention, or if you're at a rally where you are transfixed by being the physical presence of a cult-like figure, you might not realize how bizarre his answers are or his speech is here. But if you are listening to every word, and in particular if you're reading along with the transcripts, you'll see that he's shifting topics back and forth and around and upside down in a way that makes no sense whatsoever. He's all over the place. Now, in the second case, he also doesn't come remotely close to providing an actual answer to the thoughtful, albeit challenging question that was posed to him. And, this type of loosening of associations, this is something he does quite often, particularly at his rallies. In fact, there were several moments in yesterday's debate in which he approached this level of disorganization. Particularly, I remember there was a moment where he was asked about the recent bipartisan border security bill that he worked to kill. And his response started off with a rant about crowd sizes at his rallies and somehow ended up with people eating dogs.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country.
It just was like, how do you go from A to B to C? I don't know. But, it's common for people to watch these clips and others like it and to conclude that obviously Trump has dementia. What other explanation for this could there be? There is no shortage of speculation in the media on this, even quoting individuals with expertise in dementia and geriatrics. In reality, though, while phenomena like loosening of associations can be caused by dementia, There are plenty of other causes of this thought disorder, including mental illness, medication side effects, drug abuse, and other neurodegenerative diseases that aren't classically thought of as a primary dementia syndrome per se. I also want to point out that that first clip, which I think was supposed to be about the Iran nuclear deal, was from 2015, whereas the second clip was from within the last 2 weeks. That's an interval of 9 years. Now, some forms of dementia do progress more quickly than others, and some go relatively slowly, but no form of dementia stays static for that long. While these incoherent ramblings are anecdotally happening more frequently over time, if the first clip was only the consequence of dementia, I honestly would have expected to see an even greater decline in Trump's cognition since then. Likewise, while he is an outlier among politicians with the complexity of his sentence structure and the depth of his vocabulary, as I talked about earlier, that also has not really gotten worse with time, with the speed that's typical of dementia. Now, I am not saying his cognition is not worsening at all, and I'm not saying that he doesn't currently have dementia. All the findings I've discussed can be from dementia, as can his memory problems over who he's running against, his delusions about schools performing gender-affirming surgeries on kids and immigrants eating pets, his paranoia about the deep state, and his perseveration on specific ideas like his false belief that the 2020 election was stolen. All of that can be potentially explained by dementia. But I am saying that as far as his rambling and semi-incoherent speech goes, that particular one facet of Trump's cognition does not strike me as being primarily due to a primary dementia diagnosis like Alzheimer's disease, particularly given how it's been progressing only very slowly over time. Is this normal or healthy? No, absolutely not. Is it endearing like Luis? No, not remotely endearing. If I was seeing him as a patient, I would probably order some blood tests, a brain MRI, and give him a referral for formal neuropsych testing. But not all cognitive deficits in the elderly are specifically from dementia, and this is an example of that. Now, what do I think is going on in his brain? I don't know, but whatever it is, it's serious, and it will certainly not be getting better after November.
Believe me,